apologize for the delay. We had some problems with security, but I think they've all been resolved and we can move forward. I also apologize that I did not provide you with the promised refreshments, but the grant money is still in the wings, so we're going to have to do something at the end of the semester instead. I keep pushing it back, but any suggestions about what are appreciated. Tonight, last time we had Mark Mix, and I think that was a pretty interesting talk. A lot of the students seemed to gain a lot from his thoughts on unions and on right-to-work laws. Tonight we're going to do something a little broader, which is Walter Block is a distinguished economist, one of the great living libertarian economists. Walter is an alum of Brooklyn College, and I asked him to start off by talking about how his experiences here at Brooklyn led him into becoming a free market-oriented economist. And he's written over 300 journal articles and countless newspaper articles. He's been on TV numerous times and has written a very famous book that's been published into at least 10 languages called Defending the Undefendable, which is about victimless crimes, and it's regarded as a classic in the field. So I'm sure we're going to have an interesting time, and I asked Walter to promise that he'd be controversial. So without further ado, let's welcome Walter.
Thanks, Mitchell, for the kind introduction. I'd like to begin by telling you two stories about two different people. One is Ayn Rand, and the other is Bernie Sanders. Let me start with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders and I went to high school together at James Madison. Anyone from Madison here? Hey, okay, fellow Madisonians. We were both on the track team. He was the captain of the track team, and he was one of the best half-milers in the whole city. I was a mediocre runner, so I would sort of see the rear end of him receding in the distance when we ran. And it wasn't a pretty sight from the back, but... And then we both went to Brooklyn College. We were both at Brooklyn College for 1 year. I stayed and I graduated here. And he went off to the University of Chicago, but we overlapped here, and he was one of our students. So if he becomes president, then there's a possibility that he'll beat out Hillary, and then whoever is the Republican, we will have, I think, our first person who went to Brooklyn College who became president of the United States. I want to talk a little bit about his specifics, but let me first mention Ayn Rand. When I was in Brooklyn College, I had roughly the views of Bernie Sanders, sort of socialism, vaguely socialist, leftish, progressive, whatever you want to call it, hippie, I don't know, pinko. The idea was that capitalism is evil, socialism is the way to go. If we had free enterprise, we'd have starvation, and I didn't much like starvation, so I was against capitalism. And Ayn Rand came to lecture at Brooklyn College, and there must have been a big room, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 students. And I came to boo and hiss her because she favored capitalism, and we all knew that capitalism was evil. And I booed and hissed along with everyone else, pretty much, because it was sort of a leftist area. I guess it still is. I'm not sure what the demographic is now. This was in maybe 62, 63 when I was a senior at Brooklyn College. And at the end of the lecture, the Ayn Rand Study Club, or whatever it was called that had invited her to speak, said, there's a lunch in her honor and anyone can come, even if you disagree with her. And I wanted to get her, show her that socialism is the way to go. So I went to the luncheon, and there was this long, long table, maybe the length of this room, maybe 50 people on a side, long, thin table. And Ayn Rand was sitting at the head of the table, and her chief lieutenants, Nathaniel Brandon, Alan Greenspan, who later became the head of the Fed, other people who were in her senior group. And I was relegated to the foot of the table, way over there. No insult to the side of the room, but that's where she was. And I turned to my neighbor and I said, what's this capitalism stuff? It's no good. Socialism is the way to go. And he said, well, I don't really know all that much about it, but the people who do are over there. So I went over there and I stuck my head between Ayn Rand's and Nathaniel Brandon's. He was her chief lieutenant. And I said, there's a socialist here who wants to debate someone on socialism and capitalism. And they said, who is it? And I said, me. Now you remember, I was a senior in college, so I was maybe 20, 21. Brandon was maybe 35, Rand maybe 50, 55, something like that. But I was pushy, a chutzpahnik, as they say. And Brandon was very, very gentle and very nice. He said, yes, I'll come to the other end of the room because there's no room here for us to talk, on two conditions. One, you have to promise not to let the conversation lapse after this one go-around, but we keep going until we settle it. And two, you have to read two books that I'll recommend. And the two books were Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Anyone read that book? Magnificent book. If you want to learn anything about economics, that's the way to start. And the other was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, which was about this thick, about 1,100 pages of very small type. And I couldn't put that book down. I read it in one weekend. I just got, 3 hours of sleep each night. And I was blown away by those two books and by the conversations. And then I became sort of an objectivist, or in the objectivist ambit like Ayn Rand. I was converted to the one true faith of free markets and free enterprise. And all free markets are voluntary commercial interactions. So if we have a trade, and I trade you this bottle of water for my tie, it must mean that I value this bottle of water that I'm going to get more than the tie I'm going to give, and it must mean that you rank these two goods in the opposite way. You value the time more than the water. Otherwise, why would you do it, and why would I do it? Now, you might think I'm going to give you an A, but I don't even teach here, so I'm not going to give you an A if you trade. All we know is there's something about the tie that you like better. It might be you think you're going to get an A if you make the trade, which is silly. But there's something about the tie you like more, otherwise you're not making a trade. But that's all the free market system is. Voluntary interaction of a commercial nature. Buying, selling, lending, borrowing, barter. These are voluntary trades, voluntary interaction, and as an economist, as an Austrian economist, I can say that necessarily, in the ex ante sense, it makes both parties better off. Ex ante means in the sense of anticipations, namely, I value what you're giving me more than what I'm getting. You value what you're getting more than what you're giving. You're all wearing shoes. You paid, I don't know, $80 for your shoes. I deduce that at the time you bought those shoes, you valued the shoes at 80 and a penny or more. Otherwise, you wouldn't have bought them. So you dirty rats, you made a profit? You exploited the shoe salesman because you valued it more. Let's say you valued it at 90 and you paid 80. You made $10 off of him, you disgraceful, rotten kids. No, you made a profit. And he made a profit. He had dozens of shoes, hundreds of shoes. He valued them at maybe nothing. Because, if he didn't sell them, what is he going to do with them? He's got shoes up to his armpits. So he might have valued it at zero. So he made a full $80. He exploited you, you exploited him? No, you each gain from mutual benefit. That's what the market is. How can that be a bad thing? Yes, we have pornography. Yes, we have other things that people don't like. But that's not the fault of the market. That's the fault of what people want that isn't kosher or isn't nice. Right? The market is just like this computer here, or a pen, or a wristwatch. It's a tool to get you what you want. And if you want bad things, the market will get you bad things. But it's not the market's fault. It's your rotten fault if you want drugs or porn or prostitution or whatever it is that some people consider bad. Okay, so that's my Ayn Rand story. Now let me talk about two substantive elements of Bernie Sanders, because the topic was regulation, and Bernie is Mr. Regulation. I think his middle name is Regulation, Bernie Regulation Sanders. And then what I'll talk about is these two books. This is Defending the Undefendable. I didn't call it Defending the Undefendable 1, because in 1976, when it came out, I didn't realize that to be number 2. But now there's Defending the Undefendable number 2, and I'm now working on Defending the Undefendable number 3. So I'll talk a little bit about that after I deal with Bernie. And then maybe we can have some dialogue, discussion, questions, interaction, what have you. Okay. Two things that Bernie is famous for. Well, he's famous for several things, many things now. Let me just first talk about the minimum wage law. He loves the minimum wage law. He wants to raise the minimum wage law to $15 an hour, correct? And we all know what a minimum wage law is. Minimum wage law is a law that says if you pay you're an employer, if you pay your employee less, you go to jail. The employee goes to jail too, but they wouldn't put the employee in jail because they think the employee is exploited. But strictly speaking, he too or she is also violating the law because they're taking less money. But it's the employer that would really get it, de facto. De jure, they would both get it. They would both be illegal. Now, why does Bernie want to do this? And let me ask, I'm going to give you a survey. Do you favor the minimum wage law, or you oppose it, or you're neutral? How many favor the minimum wage law and or raising it? Raise your hand. Oh, very few. How many are neutral about it? And how many are opposed to it? Well, you've done a good job. These are your students.
They'll tell you that too.
Okay, well, you see, the reason that the people who favor it is because they think it's like a floor under wages, and the higher it is, the higher wages go. And, you know, if you're a decent kind of person, you want the poor to get higher wages. I mean, you have to be pretty nasty to say, no, I hate the poor, I want them to get low wages. So the goodness or the benevolence in us is inclined or biased or prejudiced in that direction that we favor it. This group here, I think, is very, what's the word I'm looking for, not like most people. If I take the next 300 people walking by Austrian and Flatbush, and I ask them that question, and they've taken surveys, like 90% of the people favor the minimum wage law and favor raising it from 7 to 10 or 10 to 12 or 12 to 15. Not so much we're worried about what you want to raise it to, but they want to raise it. But I contend it's not really a floor. It's rather a hurdle over which you have to jump. And the higher the thing is, the harder it is to jump over it. And if it gets real high, people can't jump over it. Now, when I was young, I would take a chair like that you're sitting in, and I would jump over it to indicate what's going on. Then when I got a little older, I took my attaché case and I held it up like this and I jumped over it. And then when I got a little older, I put my attaché case like this and I jumped over it. And then when I got a little older, I put it flat like this and then I jumped over it to indicate what you have to do to get a job. You have to jump over the barrier. But now that I'm a real old coot, I can't jump over that. It's too high. It's like 5 inches high. So I take a piece of paper like this, and I'm going to put it over there, and I'm going to demonstrate. The people in the front will see if I really jumped over it. So watch this, and if I do, I want a round of applause, because, you know, macho. I need a running start, because it's pretty hot. I need more. Bernie might have beat me, but I don't think he could do that now. Look, what determines wages? Is it employer generosity? That seems to be the theory that people have who favor the minimum wage law, that it's up to the employer to dictate wages, and the employers are not too happy about raising wages. They're pretty stingy and cheapskatey, and they want to lower wages as low as they can get, and that's what determines wages. Well, isn't it strange then that the guy who pushes the broom gets $10 an hour, say, $6 an hour, and the plumber gets $35 an hour, and the accountant gets $100 an hour, and the doctor gets $300 an hour, and the, I don't know, the nerd gets $500 an hour, and the top lawyer gets $1,000 an hour, and LeBron James, I don't know, he gets an hour, $10,000 an hour, I'm just picking out a number. Why, is LeBron James's employer generous? No, they're all skinflints. They all want to maximize profits, just like you do. When you went out for those shoes, you got the $80 shoe, even though there was a $120 shoe that was the same thing. You picked, you dirty rats, you picked the 80. You people disgust. No, I'm kidding. You don't disgust me. That's the human nature, to buy low and sell high. Everybody does it. So then what determines wages? productivity. Marginal revenue productivity, or if you want to get technical about it, discounted marginal revenue product, or just productivity. Now look, suppose my productivity is $20 an hour. This means that if I come work for you, your bottom line increases by $20 an hour. That's what it means, productivity. Now it's hard to estimate it. There was this guy, Jeremy Lin Sanity, remember him? You know, he went to Harvard, and Harvard guys can't play basketball, right? So nobody wanted him. And he's Oriental, and he's not 7'9" like Yao Ming. He was only, you know, a shrimp, 6'2", 6'3". In the NBA, that's very small. And see, he couldn't play. So somehow he snuck onto the, I think it was the Golden State Warriors, and he sat on the bench, and he never got in the game. And then he was in some other team, and then he got into the Knicks, and he was at the end of the bench, and he would never be allowed to play. And then somehow somebody got hurt, and he got in there, and he scored 20 points and, 10 assists or something like that, which is pretty darn good, except if you're one of the tops, then 20 points and 10 assists isn't that great. But he was just a backbencher, and that's pretty darn good. The point is, it's very hard to estimate people's productivity. And you get paid a lot if you can estimate people's productivity. And the NBA scouts get paid a lot to estimate productivity, and they couldn't do it with him. They do it with most people, but with him, they just didn't. So I'm stipulating that I'm worth $25 an hour. You guys don't know whether I am or not. You're all entrepreneurs. You're all going to maybe hire me. Now, what are you going to... You think I'm worth 25. What's your first opening bid? You're capitalist pigs, oink oink, you want to maximize revenues. What's the opening bid for my services? I'm worth 25. If you get me, your budget will go up by 25 an hour. How much? $18? You're no capitalist pig.
Experience.
No.
Free.
A penny. A penny. Right? I mean, really, it should be minus infinity. I should pay you an infinite amount for the privilege of working for you, but we won't go there into minus numbers. But a penny. I mean, that's the opening bid. Now, if you get me for a penny, how much profit are you making off of me every hour? $24.99. Okay, so say this young lady, what's your name? Yeah. Tina? Lena, sorry. Lena, I'm thinking of working for her and she's offering me a penny. What do you capitalist pigs say about them apples? Who's going to make the next bid? 2 cents. That's my man. 3 cents. You see where I'm going with this. It's going to be bid up. Now, I don't think that in any realistic situation the opening bid is going to be a penny. Because if I'm worth 25, people can estimate better than that. But the point is that if you pay less than the productivity, you're making a profit. And just as nature abhors a vacuum, the economy abhors a profit by taking advantage of it. Lena's making $24.99, and you guys are applauding her because she's exploiting workers, that's fine. But you want to exploit workers. And how can you exploit me? By going to 2 cents, 3 cents, $2, $11, up to 25. At 25, it would be equilibrium. There would be no more profit opportunities in bidding me away from anyone else. But suppose some stupid idiot pays me $35 an hour. Then what happens? They're paying me $35, I'm only giving them $25. They're losing 10, right? They keep doing that, they're going to go broke. Right? So either they're not going to do it, or if they do it, they go broke, and then they're not doing anything anymore. So that doesn't work. So what I'm trying to say is that if I'm worth 25, my wage will tend to equal 25, because if it's anything else, market forces will be brought to bear to change it. If my wage is too low, my wage will rise because of competition. If my wage is too high, the people paying that stupidly will go broke. Okay? So wages tend to equal productivity. So now we have a $7 an hour minimum wage. Isn't that right? 7.25? Let's keep it at 7 for round numbers. And now my productivity is worth $4 an hour. I'm an unskilled worker. I'm a young kid that has no experience, say. And I come to you and I say, hey, give me a job. And you see $4 written on my forehead or on my lapel. and you say, look, I have to pay you $7. I'd love to hire you for a penny or $1 or $2 or $3, but not for $7, so I'm not going to give you a job. The unemployment rate of young kids is double the unemployment rate of adults. Why? Because adults have higher productivity, more experience, whatever. The unemployment rate of white people is lower than black people for various reasons which I won't go into. The unemployment rate of young black people is quadruple the unemployment rate of white adults. Quadruple. It's up in the stratosphere. Because it's hard to jump over that hurdle because it keeps getting higher and higher. You know what the high jump record is? Something like 8'2". I mean, they're Fosbury flop, these guys jump over that. That's what you have to do, you have to jump over. And the higher it gets, the harder it is to jump over it. So Bernie Sanders, I think with the best intentions in the world, is doing a harm to the people who he presumably wants to help. The people he wants to help are at the bottom of the economic pyramid, right? Disproportionately young, disproportionately black, disproportionately troubled, wants to help them, and he's unemploying them. How is that helping? It's hurting. They're getting bored. Look, in effect, we're saying we're going into the inner city with a gun. Suppose I went into the inner city with a gun. I said, if you get a job, I'm going to shoot you. You get a job, I'm going to shoot you. Or if you give anyone a job, I'm going to shoot you. What would I be considered? A criminal? Well, these guys who are doing the same thing, only without a gun, with a law, are doing the same thing. I think they ought to be put in jail because they are creating havoc in the poor communities, the poorer communities. If the minimum wage law is so bad, why do we have it? We have this thing in economics, quo bono, who benefits? You know, they have these shows, what is it, these shows where somebody rapes somebody or somebody kills somebody and the detectives try to find out, CSI, those shows. And now what they do is chemical and biological things, they look under the fingernails and look for blood and semen and things like that in the case of rape. But another thing that the detective looks for is who gains, right? I mean, you see a dead body lying there, and you ask, well, is he an old guy with a lot of money? Let's look at his kids or his wife. Maybe they killed him and they want to get the money. We don't say they're guilty, but we say these are the suspects, right? And so we have to list suspects for who favors the minimum wage law. And I say that the suspect should be who gains from unemployment of young people. Well, I can make a list: psychologists, social workers, jailers, because these kids are going to end up in jail because they're bored, they can't work. These are just people who gain. I don't say they're guilty, but they're people who gain, and these are the people we look at. Another group that gains is unions, labor unions, and I'm going to get into labor unions in a second. How do labor unions gain? The reason labor unions gain is because suppose a labor union goes to the boss and says, boss, look, we're making 30 an hour, but we need 35. What's the first thing the boss is going to do? He's going to look for alternative factors of production. Let's say you make a rowboat. You're in the business of making rowboats, and you can make them out of plastic, wood, or metal. And I tell you that the plastic price just rose. You're going to make the rowboats more out of wood and metal and less out of plastic, right? You're going to try to substitute out of the more expensive good, factor of production, and into cheaper ones. Well, if the boss is told that the union wants a raise from 30 to 35, the first thing he's going to think is, well, maybe I should fire a few of these guys and hire 6 or 7 unskilled workers and make all these skilled workers foremen instead of workers, and they will train the unskilled workers. So I'm going to fire some of these guys, I'm going to hire some of these guys. And these guys are the poor Hispanic groups, black kids, whatever. What does the union think of them apples? The union isn't too happy with that. And before the minimum wage, you know what the union would do when the employer tried to do that? They'd first call them scabs, which seems to be hateful, calling people that. And then they try to beat up the scabs. The problem with that, it didn't look too good. You know, the young kids, they're black kids, they're Hispanic kids, you're trying to beat them up. And also they fight back. You slash their tires, they'll slash your tires. You take a baseball bat to them, they take a baseball bat to you. It wasn't really working. So they came up with this ingenious thing. So they don't have to beat up the scabs, but they can get the law to do it for them. And you know what this ingenious thing was? Guess. Minimum wage. Sure. If you raise the minimum wage from 7 to 15, it's harder to hire these kids, so you don't have to fight them. So these are the people who favor the minimum wage, and the reason they favor the minimum wage is that skilled labor, skilled unionized labor, is in competition with unskilled labor, and if the skilled labor wants to have a raise in their wage, the employer is going to want to substitute for them unskilled labor, which is a substitute, and they don't like that. So they've got to come up with a way, not a blue-collar way of dealing with it by trying to beat them up, but a white-collar way by getting a law passed that makes it difficult for them to get a job in the first place. Okay. Let me now talk about unions, another favorite of my man Bernie Sanders. One problem with them is they favor the minimum wage, which creates unemployment. So we've sort of covered that. The next thing I want to say is that what the unions think is that if it weren't for the union, the employer would pay a penny an hour, or would, exploit workers. But we know that the unions didn't really start until, well, the unions really started in 1935 during the Depression. If you want to go back a little bit to 1890, they had the Wobblies, but there was only like 1% of the labor force was unionized. Unions, the AFL and the CIO didn't really get started until the 1930s. Did wages start rising in the 1930s? No. I mean, if you compare the wage in 1930 with the wage in 1830 or 1730, it's much higher in 1830 and then much higher in 1930. So unions can hardly account for a rise in wages. Countries with no unions, like Hong Kong and Singapore, have high wages and rising wages. In Japan, they have unions, but they mainly teach the workers the company song, namely their sort of company union, which is denigrated by true unionist types. So it's hard to see how unions are responsible for great raises in wages. At the apex, the percentage of the labor force that was unionized was about 35%. Do you know what the percentage of the private labor force now that's unionized? It's in single digits, 8 or 9%. So it's hard to see how unionizing 8 or 9% of the labor force can account for everybody raising their wages. And then there are many industries that have never been touched by unions. Banks, computers. My son works for Microsoft, he's a nerd. They've never been unionized, they make good money. And there's no union helping them. And why does Microsoft pay them a good wage? Because their productivity is high, and if they didn't pay them, IBM would pay them, or Amazon would pay them, or something like that, or any number of small companies would pay them. Babysitters and maids' wages have gone up. They've never been unionized. So unions are hardly sufficient for raising wages. They're hardly necessary. What effect do they then have? Unions are more like a parasite or a tapeworm. You know what a parasite is, or a tapeworm? You eat the food and the tapeworm gets it. See, the point is, let me start with another example. Suppose we decide we're too fat. We've got to go on a diet. Do we have to go and say to Mr. Obama, please, Mr. Obama, go tell the farmers to stop producing corn and wheat and start producing rabbit food like celery and carrots? Do we have to do that? No. The capitalist system, the free enterprise system, we just start buying rabbit food like celery and carrots and lettuce, and we stop buying wheat and corn and potatoes and meat, which is heavier in sugar. And guess what happens? The prices in the rabbit food go up, and the profits in the rabbit food go up, and the prices and the profits in the other stuff goes down, and the farmers and the entrepreneurs are led by Adam Smith's invisible hand, which is a beautiful concept, to start producing what we want. Right? You don't need Mr. Obama to do this. That's the market. That's why we had hula hoops and didn't have hula hoops and had frisbees. The politicians didn't order anyone to do that. That's why we got out of the horse and buggy and into cars, because people wanted cars. Nobody had to tell anyone to do that. Okay, so now let's suppose that the rabbit food industry is unionized. And now what the rabbit food people say is, hey, look, profits are high, we want a high wage. And that stops the Adam Smith's invisible hand of people moving in toward rabbit food, because now there's no more profits in that. Namely, the unions hog it all up. That's why I use the word tapeworm. You get the point I'm making? So this is a problem. Anyone hear of the Rust Belt? No one heard of the Rust Belt? 2 or 3 people. I used to teach at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass. And Worcester, Mass made steel. It wasn't like Pittsburgh where they made the steel, but they sort of made ball bearings and ball peen hammers and little things made out of wheelbarrows and things like that. And what you had in Worcester, Mass was maybe 15 or 20 factories, each 5 stories high, each about a quarter mile by a quarter mile, all empty. Why? Because the unions boosted the wage rates above the productivity, and the companies were losing money, and the companies went down south. In Detroit is an economic basket case, if there ever was an economic basket case. What did the unions do there? They got the wages up to $75 an hour, and I'm including money wages plus fringe benefits, $75 an hour to sit on an assembly line. And it wasn't really a high-skilled job, but it was way more than their productivity, so they were losing money. So they start opening in Tennessee or in Alabama or Georgia or places like that, where the wages are more like $15 or $20 an hour, which is decent for semi-skilled work, but isn't highway robbery. So that's what a Rust Belt means. All these empty factories in Detroit, all throughout the Northeast, where unions were heavy. And then what Ted Kennedy wanted to do is to make a good minimum wage in the South so that the companies wouldn't come down south. Not so much to help the poor, but to help the unions. Do libertarians favor unions or not? Notice I'm now introducing a new concept. Before I was more talking about economics, wages, equal productivity. Now I'm talking about something else. Libertarianism is not a theory of economics. Economics is a theory of what causes what, why are prices the way they are, why do we have unemployment, things like that. Libertarianism is more shoulds. What should we do? What should the law be? And the answer that libertarians give is that we should have the non-aggression principle. People should keep their mitts to themselves. They shouldn't grab other people or their property without their permission. Now they can grab other people with permission. For example, in a boxing match, I'm going to now box Mitch, and he punches me in the jaw, and I say, whoa, there's assault and battery. No, because I've agreed to be in the ring with him. Now, if he hits me below the belt, or if he bites my ear, as happened, well, that's not cool. Don't do that, Mitch. But the point is that if it's voluntary, it's okay. Anything between consenting adults, even sadomasochism. Do you know the sadomasochistic joke? There is a sadomasochistic joke. Look, I'm an economist. I can't tell a joke to save my rear end, but I'll try. The masochist says to the sadist, beat me. And the sadist says, no. You get it? No. It's sort of like when an economist tells a joke, it's sort of like when a bear plays the violin while riding the unicycle. You don't say, is the bear in tune? You say, wow, a bear riding a unicycle, playing a violin, whoa. So when an economist tells a joke, you don't say, is it funny or not? You laugh. Because an economist telling a joke, I mean, that's like a bear, okay. I'll leave it alone. So I've given you a economic analysis of the unions. Now I'm going to give a libertarian analysis of unions. Are unions legitimate organizations? And my answer is, yes, unions are legitimate organizations if they limit themselves to one of the two policies or implements or strategies that they have. They have two. One is legitimate and the other is not. What's the legitimate strategy that the union can employ? A mass quit. Look, does anyone have a right to quit a job? Yeah. I mean, if you can't quit the job, you're a slave. I mean, that was the big problem with slavery is you couldn't quit. If you could quit, it wouldn't be so bad. I once told the New York Times that, and they quoted me as saying that slavery wasn't so bad. I didn't mean that. I meant if you could quit, it wouldn't be so bad. But you can't quit. So if you can quit your job, that's a legitimate thing. Do you lose your right to quit when other people quit? No. Just because other people are exercising their rights doesn't mean you can't exercise your rights. So the union can have a mass quit. So for example, one guy walks into the boss's office and he says, hey boss, I need a raise, I'm making 10, I need 15. And the boss says, my way or the highway, don't let the door hit you on the backside on the way out. In the next scenario, the guy comes in and says, look, I represent all 500 workers and we all want a raise from 10 to 15, and if we don't get it, we're all gonna quit. Now the boss says, whoa, they're a bunch of bums, but at least, they work. I have contracts. I've got the raw materials coming in. I've got contracts to send stuff out. They're not that bad. I'll bargain with them. I'll say, look, I can't go from 10 to 15. How about 13? And, they say 11 or, whatever. So that's a legitimate ploy. The other tool that they use is they surround the factory. They have a picket line, and they won't let raw materials in. They won't let finished goods out. They won't let scabs in to take their places. Well, now this is a horse of a different color. This is a violation of the libertarian non-aggression principle. Here they're using violence. See, in the first case, they were just quitting, which they have a right to do because we believe in free association. Nobody should be forced to associate with anyone against his will. The big problem with the rape is that the rape victim doesn't want to associate with the rapist. So we have to uphold free association. Well, what they're doing now is roughly equivalent. Look, suppose you divorce your wife. It's a tragedy, you're married, you thought you'd live happily ever after, you divorce your wife. But now suppose you surround her house with your friends, and any guy that tries to date her, you beat him up. That's not cool. That's very different. So the libertarian view on divorce is, okay, you can divorce, but you can't stop your ex-wife from dating other men. And the same thing for unions. Yes, you can divorce your workers, you can fire them all, or you can all quit, but you can't use violence to uphold what you're doing. So it's a complicated thing, and I once did some research to find out, are there any legitimate unions? Namely, unions that only use the first tool and never the second tool. And I went through a whole bunch of unions, and I finally came up with one. It was called CLAC, C-L-A-C, Christian Labor Association of Canada, Christian group. So I call them up and I say, look, would you use violence? Would you use a beat-up scale? Oh, no, turn the other cheek, we're Christians, yak, yak, yak. And I said, well, what do you think of labor legislation that forces the employer to bargain fairly with you? And I said, well, we favor that. Well, now what you're doing is getting the government to, look, you want a divorce, and the government is telling you have to deal fairly with the spouse that you want to divorce. The employer doesn't want these workers anymore. And the law says that he must deal fairly with them. He doesn't want to deal with them at all. Namely, he's violating his rights of free association. So even CLAC didn't make it as a legitimate union. I'm still looking, I'm open, there might be a legitimate one. So I think the libertarian analysis of unions is not, should we have them or not, it depends on what they do. And it just so happens that most of them employ both of these tools, and only one of these tools is legitimate. Okay, I've now done minimum wage and unions. I'm going to do one more thing of Bernie, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this book. I think I'm supposed to go for an hour, is that right? And when do we start? Like 6?
Go as long as you need to.
Okay, another 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions. Okay, Bernie now wants to have free tuition for all college students. That's another ploy, another plank in his platform. How many people favor that?
Don't lie.
You rotten kids, I'm going to get you for that. Let me put it this way. I favor free everything. We shouldn't have to pay for bubble gum, we shouldn't have to pay for wristwatches, we shouldn't have to pay for shirts, we shouldn't have to pay for bottled water, we shouldn't have to pay for shoes. Everything should be free. Namely, I favor non-scarcity, and that's what's going to happen when we have no scarcity. Problem is we have scarcity. Scarcity means we want more than we have, and we're such pigs, we always want more than we have. No matter how much we're going to get, we're going to want more. No matter what we get in the next 10 years, we want a cure of cancer, cure of MS, we want to live forever, we want to go to the moon and Mars, we want to go to Betelgeuse, we want to, I don't know, there was a wonderful movie, the producers by Zero Mostel, and they had a scene around Lincoln Center where they were running around Lincoln Center. Anyone see that? Well, you must see the producers, a magnificent movie. Springtime for Hitler was, just out of this world. In any case, one of the lines in the movie is, I want everything I've ever seen in the movies, was a line in the movie. Look, I favor post-scarcity. The problem is we're never going to get there because we always want more. Even Gandhi, who lived in a diaper and drank cow's urine or something, milk, I don't know what he was doing. He wanted the British out of India, which is, a big thing. But even he wanted a cow or, cloth for his diaper. But Bernie Sanders isn't saying that. He's not saying that we should have free anything. What he's saying is that rather we should take some money from some people and give it to some other people. That's what he's really saying. Not that it should be free. Any more than the highways are free, they should not be called freeways. They should be called taxways. Because they're paid for by taxes, they're not free. Right? Right now, the allocation between peas and carrots, as far as I'm concerned, is not a problem. The New York Times didn't mention this. Anyone think that the problem of allocation of peas and carrots is wrong? No. But suppose I said I want free peas. Sounds good, we want free peas. Well, if we took money away from other things and we reduced the price of peas, we'd have more peas and fewer carrots relatively. Was right now, we just admitted or we stipulated that the allocation of peas and carrots was rational. Because if it was irrational, markets would make it right. Look, suppose we wanted way more peas than carrots. Well, we'd start buying more peas and fewer carrots, and the prices and the profits in peas would go up, and people would get out of carrots and into peas until the allocation was the way we wanted it. So I assume that the allocation between peas and carrots on the one hand, and shoes on the other hand, and education on the third hand is okay. Because if it wasn't okay, market forces would move in such a way as to rearrange things so that the allocation of these goods was more in line with what we wanted, just like when we went on a diet, remember? The rabbit food versus the fattening food. So what Bernie Sanders is doing is putting his big fat thumb on the scale, and he's misallocating resources. He's going to put too much into education and less into something else. You see, he never talks about the other thing that we'll have less of. We've got to have less of something unless we have more wealth, and we're not getting more wealth by just redistributing it. So if we have more education, we got to have less shoes, or less basketballs, or less, I don't know what, eyebrow pencils, just less of something else, or less of many other things. And yet, that's not what the people want. But it sounds good. It sounds as if he's giving us something, but he's not. He's just taking away resources from other things and putting them in education. Look, I'm not against education. I'm educated, I'm a professor, I have a PhD, I like education. But I don't think that we should force other people to have it when they don't want it. Not everybody wants it. Not everybody wants peas. And if I orchestrated things that nobody could have carrots and everyone had to have peas, I wouldn't be doing anyone any favors. If peas were free, namely if we took a lot of money and we gave it to the pea industry, we'd have less, rubber bands and paper clips. So I don't think Bernie is such a great guy on unions, on minimum wage, and on free education. Okay, I've done enough with Bernie and enough with Ayn Rand. Let me talk about these two books. These two books are my homage to Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. What they have in common, at least in my own mind, is Henry Hazlitt had one message: look at all the implications of any economic activity, not just the short run, but the long run, not just on these people, but on everybody. And then he had 30 chapters illustrating that. Well, these books have the same thing. They have one message, and then each around 30, 35 chapters illustrating the principle. So I've given you Henry Hazlitt's principle. Let me give you the principle here, and then let me give you the specifics. I'll read off the chapters. And then I'll talk about 2 or 3 of the most controversial ones, because Mitch wanted me to be controversial. And then we'll have some questions and discussion. Okay, so what's the principle behind these? The principle behind these is libertarianism. And libertarianism is predicated on the non-aggression principle. And what I'm defending is anyone who violates who doesn't violate the non-aggression principle and yet is either hated by everybody or prohibited by law. So again, the libertarian principle is non-aggression principle. Keep your mitts off of other people unless you have their permission, and keep your mitts off their property. Don't be raping them, don't be murdering them, don't be stealing from them, don't be threatening them, don't be doing any nasty stuff to them, and then do whatever you want between consenting adults. Kids are always a special problem. So that's libertarianism. And yet there are actors, professions, where they adhere to this. They uphold the libertarian principles. They act compatibly with the libertarian principles, and yet they are cordially hated by everybody, or virtually everybody, or are prohibited by law. And I'm defending them. And I think I created a new word. You know, I started out at Brooklyn College as an English major, and then I turned to philosophy, and then my graduate studies in economics. There is really no word undefendable. It's indefensible, but I don't know, I got it past the publisher, and it seems like it should be a word, so I sort of stuck with it, so I got it here, and in my 3rd volume in this series, I'll use that word again. Okay, so what are the chapters? And as I read off these chapters, think, do these actors, are they compatible with libertarian principle of non-aggression, and are they either hated or prohibited by law? And if so, then they belong in the book, and if not, I shouldn't have put them in. Okay, so here is the list. The first one is on sex: the prostitute, the pimp, and the male chauvinist pig. I claim that none of them violate the libertarian law, and yet either they're illegal or hated unjustifiably. Medical: the drug pusher, the drug addict; free speech, the blackmailer, the slibeler; slanderer or libeler, the denier of academic freedom; the advertiser, the person who yells fire in a crowded theater. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that's sort of a controversial one. But you know, everyone says you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and I'm defending that. Under outlaw, the gypsy cab driver. This book came out in '76, so there were no Lyft and Uber then, but I would put them in the same category. The ticket scalper, the dishonest cop. I'll talk about that. Under financial, the non-governmental counterfeiter, the miser, the inheritor, the moneylender, the non-contributor to charity. If you don't contribute to charity, you're not violating libertarian law, but everyone hates you. Under business and trade, the curmudgeon, the slumlord, the ghetto merchant, the speculator, the importer, the middleman, the profiteer. Under ecology, the strip miner, the litterer, and the waste maker. And under labor, the fat capitalist big employer. That's where I go over the minimum wage. The scab, you know where I got that from. The rape buster, and the employer of child labor. So we'll talk maybe a little bit about that one too, because that might be a controversial one. And in the second volume, I've got a new cast of characters, but the same principle.